They say kindness is a weakness in a world ruled by power. For 20-year-old Cecilia Hart, kindness was the only thing she had left to give. Starving, freezing, and abused by a cruel town that wanted her gone, she made a choice that defied logic. She gave her last scrap of meat to a dying, blooded creature in the snow. She didn't know that the wounded pup was the most feared predator on the continent. She didn't know that her act of mercy had just started a war. And she certainly didn't know that when the sun went down the next day, the headlights of 50 black SUVs would surround her shack, and a king would drop to his knees. The wind in Blackwood Ridge didn't just blow, it bit. It chewed through the thin walls of the rusted trailer that Cecilia "Cece" Hart called home, sinking its teeth into her bones. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. The date didn't matter much to Cece. Every day was a carbon copy of the last. Survive, keep her head down, and try not to freeze. She sat on the edge of her sagging mattress, staring at the plastic plate on her lap. One piece of grilled chicken. It was dry, slightly burnt, and it was the mistake meal from the diner she worked at. It was supposed to be her dinner and tomorrow's lunch. Her stomach growled, a painful, hollow sound that echoed in the tiny room. Thump. The sound came from outside. It was heavy, wet, and desperate. Cece froze. She lived on the edge of the uncharted forestry, miles from the main town. No one came out here. Not unless they were hiding something, or burying something. Whimper. That sound broke her paralysis. It wasn't a human sound. It was animalistic, pitched high with agony. Cece grabbed her coat, a threadbare thing she'd found at a charity bin 3 years ago, and the flashlight that flickered more often than it shone. She pushed open the tin door, the hinges screaming against the frost. "Hello?" she whispered, the wind snatching her voice away. The beam of her flashlight swept across the snow-covered weeds. Then it landed on him. He wasn't a pup, not really. He was massive, even curled up in a ball of misery. His fur was a midnight black, matted with mud and something darker, thicker. Blood. So much blood. It pooled beneath his flank, staining the pristine white snow a horrifying crimson. He was shaking violently. Cece gasped, dropping to her knees despite the freezing slush soaking through her jeans. "Oh God, you poor thing." The wolf's head snapped up. A low growl rumbled in his chest, vibrating through the ground. His eyes were startling, a piercing, electric cobalt blue that seemed too intelligent for a wild animal. But they were glazed with pain. A deep gash ran along his ribs, looking like it had been made by a serrated blade. Most people would have run. A wolf this size could snap a human neck like a twig. But Cece didn't see a monster. She saw something abandoned. She saw herself. "It's okay," she cooed, inching forward. "I'm not going to hurt you." The wolf bared his teeth, but his head was too heavy. It thunked back into the snow. He was dying. Cece scrambled back inside the trailer. She didn't have bandages. She didn't have medicine. She grabbed the only clean towel she owned and the plastic plate with the burnt chicken. Running back out, she knelt beside the beast. The metallic smell of wolf blood was overwhelming. "I know it hurts," she whispered, her hands shaking as she pressed the towel against the gash on his side. The wolf snarled, his body tense. He tried to snap at her, but he was too weak. "Stop it," she scolded gently, ignoring the lethal jaws inches from her face. "I'm trying to help." She applied pressure. The heat radiating off him was unnatural, like a furnace. For an hour, she sat in the freezing snow, holding the towel until the bleeding slowed to a sluggish ooze. Her fingers were numb, turning a dangerous shade of blue. The wolf watched her. He didn't blink. Those cobalt eyes tracked every shiver of her body. "I don't have much," Cece whispered, her teeth chattering. She pushed the plate forward. "But you need to eat to heal." The wolf sniffed the dry chicken. He looked at the food, then back at the girl. He could smell her hunger. He could hear the emptiness of her stomach. He knew this was all she had. He whined, a soft, confused sound, and nudged the plate back toward her with his wet nose. Tears pricked Cece's eyes. "Don't be stubborn," she choked out, a sad smile touching her lips. "I'm used to being hungry. You're losing blood. Eat." She hand-fed him. The massive beast took the meat with a gentleness that contradicted his size, his rough tongue grazing her frozen fingers. When the food was gone, he rested his heavy head on her knee. They stayed like that until the first grey light of dawn touched the horizon. "I have to go to work," Cece whispered, stroking the coarse fur between his ears. "Please be here when I get back. I'll try to bring scraps." She stood up, her legs stiff and aching. The wolf watched her go, his blue eyes burning with a promise she couldn't understand yet. As she closed the trailer door, she didn't see the black SUV idling a mile down the road, nor did she see the wolf's form shimmer and contort as he forced himself to shift, reaching for a buried phone in the snow. The Rusty Spoon diner smelled of stale grease and regret. It was the only place in town that would hire someone with no family name and no connections. Cece walked in 5 minutes late. Her uniform was clean, but her shoes were soaked through from the snow, squelching with every step. "You're late, Hart." The voice was like grating gravel. Mr. Henderson, the owner, stood behind the counter. He was a man who sweated grease and thrived on making young girls cry. He held a clipboard like a weapon. "I'm sorry, Mr. Henderson," Cece said, tying her apron quickly. The roads were bad." "Excuses," Henderson sneered. He leaned in, sniffing the air. He wrinkled his nose. "And you smell like a wet dog. It's disgusting. You're scaring the customers away." The diner was empty, except for Old Man Miller in the corner. "I'll scrub down in the bathroom," Cece pleaded. She needed this shift. She needed the tips to buy gauze for the wolf. "Don't bother," Henderson said, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He ripped a page off his clipboard and let it flutter to the floor. "You're fired." The world stopped. "What?" "You heard me. You're trash, Cecilia. You bring the property value down just by existing. I found a replacement. Someone cleaner. Lydia Cross starts today." The bell above the door chimed. Lydia Cross walked in. She was the town's golden girl, blonde, vicious, and the daughter of the local sheriff. She smirked at Cece, popping a bubble of gum. "Oops," Lydia laughed. "Did I take your spot?" "My bad." "Mr. Henderson, please," Cece's voice shook. "I have rent due tomorrow. If I don't pay, they'll evict me. I have nowhere to go." Henderson leaned over the counter, his face inches from hers. "That sounds like a you problem. Now get out before I call Lydia's daddy to drag you out." Humiliation burned hotter than the freezing cold outside. Cece stripped off her apron, leaving it on the counter. She walked out, head high, refusing to let them see her cry. But the moment the door closed behind her, she crumbled. The walk home was a blur of tears and panic. "What am I going to do?" she thought. "I have $4. I have no food." When she finally reached the clearing where her trailer stood, the sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across the snow. She ran to the spot where she had left the wolf. "Hey!" she called out, wiping her eyes. "I'm back. I didn't bring food, I'm sorry, but—" She stopped. The snow was trampled. The blood stain was there, drying into the dirt. But the wolf was gone. "No," she whispered, falling to her knees in the slush. No, no, no. He was the only living thing that hadn't looked at her with disgust. He was the only warmth she had felt in years. And now he was gone, just like everything else. Cece curled up on the cold ground where the wolf had been. She smelled the lingering scent of pine and rain on the snow, his scent. "I hope you made it," she whispered into the empty air. "I hope you found your pack." She didn't have the energy to go inside. She sat there as the darkness took over, shivering, defeated. She closed her eyes, ready to let the cold take her. It would be easier this way. Then the ground began to vibrate. It started as a low hum, then grew into a rumble. Cece opened her eyes. Lights, blinding, white LED lights cut through the forest darkness. Not one pair. Not two. Dozens. A convoy of sleek, matte black SUVs was tearing down the dirt path, crushing the saplings under their reinforced tires. They were moving with military precision. Cece scrambled back, pressing her back against the aluminum siding of her trailer. "The police?" she thought, terrified. "Did Henderson call the sheriff? Is Lydia trying to arrest me for trespassing?" The cars fanned out, forming a semicircle around her tiny, pathetic home. The headlights turned the night into day, blinding her. She shielded her eyes, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The engines cut simultaneously. Silence descended, heavy and suffocating. The sound of car doors opening echoed in the clearing. Clack, clack, clack. Men stepped out, dozens of them. They were huge, towering figures in tailored suits that strained against massive muscles. They didn't look like police. They looked like an army. They stood perfectly still, hands clasped in front of them, heads bowed slightly. Then the center vehicle's door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, well over 6'5". He wore a charcoal trench coat over a suit that cost more than Cece's entire life earnings. His hair was dark, swept back from a face that was brutally handsome, sharp jawline, high cheekbones, and an aura of power that made the air crackle. He walked toward her. His gait was predatory, smooth, and dangerous. Cece couldn't breathe. She pressed herself harder against the trailer, trembling. I didn't steal anything," she stammered, her voice tiny. "Please, I'm leaving." The man stopped 3 feet away from her. He looked down, and then Cece saw his eyes. Cobalt blue, electric, intense. The same eyes that had watched her from the snow the night before. The man didn't speak. He slowly lowered himself, ignoring the mud ruining his expensive trousers, until he was kneeling on one knee in front of her. He was now at eye level with her, just as he had been when he was a wolf. He reached out, his large, warm hand cupping her frozen cheek. "Who did this to you?" His voice was a deep baritone, laced with a rage that wasn't directed at her, but for her. He ran his thumb over the tear tracks on her face. Cece was paralyzed. What? "You smell like sorrow," he said, his nostrils flaring slightly. "And you smell like that grease trap in town. Who made you cry, Cecilia?" "How do you know my name?" she whispered. "I know the name of the woman who saved my life," he said softly. He stood up then, extending a hand to her. "My name is Silas Mercer. I am the Alpha of the Obsidian Shadow Pack. And you?" He looked back at the army of men standing behind him, then back to her. "You just became the most protected woman on this earth." He turned his head slightly toward a man with a scar over his eye, standing by the car. "Beta Kyle," Silas commanded, his voice turning to ice. "Find out who fired her. Find out who evicted her. Buy the building. Buy the diner. Burn them to the ground if you have to. But bring me their heads." "Yes, Alpha," the men roared in unison, the sound shaking the trees. Silas turned back to Cece, his expression softening instantly. "Come, little one. You fed me when you had nothing. Tonight, the pack feeds you." The interior of the SUV smelled of expensive leather, mahogany, and the faint, lingering scent of ozone. The smell of power. Cece sat stiffly in the corner of the back seat, her threadbare coat pulled tight around her throat. She was trembling, not from the cold anymore, but from the terrifying reality of her situation. Next to her sat Silas Mercer, the Alpha King, the man who had been a dying wolf in her yard just 24 hours ago. He was on the phone, his voice low and lethal. "I don't care about the jurisdiction, Sheriff Cross," Silas said, his eyes fixed on the passing dark forest outside the tinted window. "Your town is on my territory. If I say investigate the diner, you investigate the diner. If you hesitate, I will replace you with someone who understands the hierarchy." Cece flinched at the name Sheriff Cross. That was Lydia's father, the man who had turned a blind eye when his daughter threw rocks at Cece's trailer last summer. Silas hung up the phone with a sharp click and turned to her. The change in his demeanor was instant. The cold tyrant vanished, replaced by an intense, brooding protector. "You're shaking," he observed. It wasn't a question. I'm not supposed to be here," Cece whispered, gripping the door handle. "You can't just take me. People will notice." Silas let out a dark, humorless chuckle. "Cecilia, look at me." She hesitated, then turned her wide hazel eyes to meet his electric blue ones. "Who will notice?" he asked, his voice soft but brutally honest. "The boss who fired you? The landlord evicting you? The town that let a 20-year-old girl starve in a tin can?" The truth hit her like a physical blow. He was right. If she disappeared tonight, no one would file a report. She was a ghost in her own life. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why are you doing this? I just gave you some chicken. It wasn't even fresh." Silas shifted, his massive frame taking up most of the space. He reached out, his hand hovering over her hand before gently covering it. His skin was scorching hot. "It wasn't just chicken," Silas said, his gaze intensifying. "I was poisoned, Cecilia. Silver nitrate and concentrated wolfsbane. It's a cocktail designed to kill an alpha in minutes. My healing factor was gone. I was dying." He paused, watching her reaction. "When you touched me," he continued, "when you pressed that towel to my side, the pain stopped. When you fed me, my strength returned. You didn't just feed a stray dog. You neutralized a poison that should have killed me. You did something impossible." Cece blinked. I don't understand. I'm just human. I don't have magic." "We'll see," Silas murmured, leaning back. "But even if you are just human, you are the human who saved the king, and the Obsidian Shadow Pack pays its debts in blood and gold." The car slowed down. They had been driving for an hour, climbing higher into the mountains, far past the limits of Blackwood Ridge, where Cece had lived her whole life. "Where are we?" she asked, peering out the window. "Home," Silas said. The heavy iron gates, emblazoned with a howling wolf crest, swung open automatically. The convoy drove up a winding paved road, lined with ancient pine trees. At the top of the rise stood the citadel. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress disguised as a modern mansion. It was a sprawling structure of black stone, glass, and steel, cantilevered over the edge of a cliff overlooking the entire valley. It glowed with golden light, looking like a castle floating in the night sky. As the cars pulled into the circular driveway, Cece saw people. Dozens of them. They weren't soldiers this time. They were staff, dressed in crisp uniforms, lined up on the steps. The car door opened. Silas stepped out first, buttoning his trench coat, He turned and offered his hand to her. "Come," he commanded gently. Cece took his hand. As she stepped out of the car, the freezing mountain air hit her, but she didn't have time to shiver. "Welcome home, Alpha," the staff shouted in unison, bowing their heads low. Cece shrank back, trying to hide behind Silas's large frame. She was wearing muddy jeans with holes in the knees and a coat that smelled of mildew. She felt like a stain on this pristine picture. An older woman stepped forward from the line. She was tall, severe-looking, with silver hair pulled back into a tight bun. She wore a black suit that looked sharper than a knife. "Alpha," the woman said, her eyes darting to Cece. Her expression didn't change, but her nostrils flared slightly. "We were not expecting a guest." "She is not a guest, Lady Genevieve," Silas said, his voice booming across the courtyard so everyone could hear. "This is Cecilia Hart. She is under my personal protection. Prepare the East Wing, the Master Suite." A ripple of shock went through the staff. Cece saw eyes widen. "The Master Suite?" Genevieve repeated, her composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "Alpha, that is usually reserved for the mate of the pack." Silas narrowed his eyes. "Did I stutter, Genevieve?" "No, Alpha," she bowed quickly, her face pale. "I will arrange it immediately." Silas put a protective hand on the small of Cece's back and guided her up the stairs. "Don't mind them," he whispered in her ear. "They aren't used to me bringing anything home other than war." As they crossed the threshold into the massive foyer, a room with ceilings 3 stories high and a chandelier made of actual crystals, Cece felt a wave of dizziness. The floor was marble, heated from beneath. The walls were adorned with art that probably cost more than her entire town. "I can't pay you back for this," Cece panicked, stopping in the middle of the hall. "I have $4. Silas stopped and turned to her. He looked down at her muddy boots staining his white marble floor. He didn't care. "You think I want your money?" He stepped closer, towering over her. "Cecilia, look at yourself. You're malnourished. You're freezing. You're terrified. My only goal right now is to fix what the world broke." He gestured to a young maid who was hovering nervously nearby. "Elise, take Miss Hart to the spa bathroom. Draw a bath. Hot. Add the healing salts from the northern territories. And burn those clothes." "Burn them?" Cece gasped. "That's all I have." "Not anymore," Silas said. "Go. Wash away the smell of that town. I have business to attend to. When you come out, dinner will be waiting. And Cecilia." She looked back at him. "Eat as much as you want," he said, his eyes softening. "No one in this house goes hungry. Ever." The bathroom was larger than Cece's entire trailer. It was a sanctuary of white marble and gold fixtures. The bathtub was a sunken pool in the center of the room, overlooking the snowy peaks through a floor-to-ceiling glass wall. Elise, the young maid, was kind but silent. She moved efficiently, pouring purple salts into the steaming water that smelled of lavender and eucalyptus. "The Alpha ordered these specifically," Elise said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "They help with bruising and muscle fatigue." Cece stripped off her clothes with hesitation. She was ashamed of her body. She was too thin. Her ribs were visible against her pale skin, her hip bones jutting out sharply. And then there were the marks. A cigarette burn on her shoulder from a foster father 3 years ago. A jagged scar on her thigh from falling on a rusted fence while running from neighborhood dogs. The kaleidoscope of blue and yellow bruises on her arms from carrying heavy crates at the diner. She sank into the hot water, letting out a long, shuddering breath. It stung at first, then soothed. For the first time in her life, She felt warm all the way to her bones. She scrubbed her skin raw, trying to wash away the scent of grease, the scent of poverty, the scent of being unwanted. When she finally emerged an hour later, wrapped in a robe made of silk so soft it felt like water, she felt like a different person. But when she walked into the adjoining dressing room, she stopped dead. A doctor was waiting. He was a man in his 40s, with kind eyes and wire-rimmed glasses. He held a tablet. "Miss Hart," he said, bowing his head. "I am Dr. Reed. The Alpha asked me to give you a checkup before dinner." "I'm fine," Cece said automatically. It was a reflex. "I'm fine. Don't look at me. Don't notice me." "With respect," Dr. Reed said gently. "Alpha Silas told me you were surviving on 1 meal a day. That is not fine. Please, sit." The exam was quick but thorough. Dr. Reed frowned as he ran a scanner over her arm. He pressed his fingers gently against her ribs. "You have a hairline fracture in your left rib," he noted, typing on his tablet. "Old. Maybe 2 years. It never healed properly." "I fell," Cece lied. She hadn't fallen. Mr. Henderson had shoved her into a counter when she dropped a plate. "And you are severely anemic," Dr. Reed continued. "Your body is in survival mode. If you had stayed out in that snow another week, you likely would have gone into cardiac arrest." The door to the room slammed open. Silas stood there. He had changed out of his suit into a black button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms covered in faint white scars. But his face was thunderous. "Well?" Silas demanded, looking at the doctor. "Report." Dr. Reed hesitated, looking at Cece. "Alpha, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "Report," Silas growled. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with his command. Dr. Reed sighed. "She is 20 pounds underweight. Malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies. She has an improperly healed rib fracture, signs of past physical trauma consistent with abuse, and her cortisol levels are through the roof. She has been living in a state of high-stress fear for years." Silas went very still. He walked over to where Cece sat on the medical table. He didn't look at the doctor. He looked at the scar on her shoulder that was visible where the robe had slipped. He reached out, tracing the skin around the scar without touching it, as if afraid he would break her. "Who did this?" he asked. His voice was terrifyingly quiet. "It doesn't matter," Cece whispered, looking down at her lap. "He's gone. It was a foster home a long time ago." "Everything matters," Silas said. "Every hurt you have ever suffered matters to me." He turned to Dr. Reed. "Fix her. Whatever supplements, whatever treatments. I want her healthy. I want her strong." "Of course, Alpha," Dr. Reed said. "I've already prescribed a nutrient plan, but there is something else." Silas turned back. "What?" "Her blood work," Dr. Reed said, tapping the tablet. "There's an anomaly. Her white blood cell count is normal, but her cellular regeneration rate, it's slightly elevated. Not like a wolf, but faster than a human. And there are trace markers in her DNA." "Markers of what?" Silas asked sharply. "I'm not sure yet," Dr. Reed admitted. "It looks like dormancy, like something is waiting to wake up." Silas looked at Cece with a renewed intensity. The hidden identity aspect was no longer just a feeling. It was medical fact. "Keep that between us," Silas commanded. "If the council hears about an anomaly, they will want to dissect her." "Understood." Dr. Reed nodded and packed his bag. "Rest, Miss Hart, and eat." When the doctor left, the room fell silent. Silas pulled a chair over and sat in front of her, their knees almost touching. "You look better," he said, his eyes scanning her clean face. "But you still look sad." "I'm waiting for the catch," Cece admitted. Rich, powerful kings don't rescue diner waitresses for nothing. What do you want from me, Silas? Silas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I want to find the person who poisoned me, he said. The assassination attempt yesterday. It was an inside job. Someone in my court, someone in this house, wants me dead. They used a poison that is rare, expensive, and untraceable. Cece's breath hitched. And you think I know who it is? No, Silas said. I think you are the only person I can trust, because you are the only one who had nothing to gain by saving me. You didn't know who I was. You saved the wolf, not the king. He stood up and offered her his hand again. Tonight, we dine in the great hall, he said. My beta, my gamma, and the top advisors will be there. I need you to sit next to me. I need you to be my eyes. You have lived your life watching people, reading their moods to survive, haven't you? Cece nodded. She had learned to read Mr. Henderson's anger before he shouted. She had learned to read the customers to get better tips. Yes, she said. Good, Silas said, a dangerous smirk curling his lips. Watch them. Watch who looks at you with disgust. Watch who looks at you with fear. And watch who looks at me with surprise that I'm still breathing. And then what? Cece asked, taking his hand. And then, Silas said, pulling her to her feet. We hunt. They walked out of the suite, not as a king and a stray, but as partners. But as they headed toward the great hall, Cece didn't know that the person who poisoned Silas was already sitting at the dinner table, smiling, and waiting for the news of the Alpha's death. The doors to the great hall boomed open. 20 people sat at a long obsidian table. The conversation stopped instantly. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Silas walked in, Cece on his arm. He looked vibrant, powerful, and very much alive. Good evening, Silas boomed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. At the far end of the table, a man with pale skin and a goatee, Councillor Vane, dropped his wine glass. It shattered on the floor, the red liquid spreading like blood. Silas smiled, a predator baring his teeth. You look like you've seen a ghost, Vane, Silas said smoothly. Or were you expecting a funeral? The silence in the great hall was heavy enough to crush bones. All eyes were glued to Councillor Vane's shattered wine glass, the red liquid seeping into the grout of the obsidian floor like a fresh wound. My apologies, Alpha, Vane stammered, his face a mask of pale composure. He signaled to a server with a twitch of his hand. Slippery fingers. I was just overwhelmed with relief to see you well. The rumors were distressing. Rumors travel fast, Silas said, his voice smooth and dark as velvet. He pulled out the heavy, high-backed chair to his immediate right. Sit, Cecilia. A collective gasp rippled through the table. A woman with fiery red hair and lips painted a dangerous shade of crimson leaned forward. This was Bianca Roth, the daughter of the Alpha of the Southern Territories, and, until tonight, the front-runner to be Silas's mate. She looked at Cece's silk robe, which was undeniably Silas's property, with eyes that promised murder. Alpha, Bianca purred, though her tone was razor-sharp. Surely there has been a mistake. That seat is reserved for the Pack Beta, or the Pack Queen. You cannot possibly intend for this human to sit there. She smells like diner grease. And fear. Cece froze, her hand gripping the back of the velvet chair. The shame threatened to swallow her whole. She wanted to run back to the trailer, back to the cold where she belonged. But then she felt Silas's hand on her shoulder. It was heavy, warm, and grounding. This human, Silas said, addressing the room but staring directly at Bianca, saved your king while you were all sleeping in your silk sheets. If she wants to sit on the table and eat with her hands, she will. If she wants to burn this hall to the ground, I will hand her the match. Do not test me tonight, Bianca." Bianca's mouth snapped shut, her face flushing an ugly shade of mottled red. Silas guided Cece into the chair and sat at the head of the table. Serve the food. The dinner was a blur of opulence Cece couldn't comprehend. Plates of roasted venison, truffle-infused mashed potatoes, and glazed vegetables were placed before her. It was more food than she had seen in a year, but her stomach was knotted so tight she wasn't sure she could eat. "Eat," Silas murmured, leaning close to her. "Ignore them. Look at me." Cece cut a small piece of meat. She took a bite. It was delicious, but as she chewed, she did what Silas had asked. She watched. She had spent years making herself invisible in the diner, watching customers. She knew the telltale signs of a lie. She knew the fidgeting of a guilty conscience. She watched Councillor Vane. He wasn't eating. He was drinking water, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. She watched the servers. They moved like ghosts, terrified of making a sound, but her eyes locked on one server in particular, a young man, barely older than her, with sandy blonde hair. He was holding a decanter of dark red wine. He was moving toward Silas. As he approached the head of the table, Cece saw it. The server's hand wasn't just shaking, it was trembling with a rhythmic spasm. Sweat beaded on his upper lip, despite the cool air of the hall. And then a smell hit her. It wasn't the food. It wasn't the expensive perfume of the court ladies. It was faint, sharp, and bitter, like crushed almonds and copper. Cece had smelled it once before, in the rat traps behind the diner when the exterminator came. Poison. The server stepped up to Silas's left side. "Your wine, Alpha," the boy whispered, his voice cracking. Silas, distracted by a question from his gamma, lifted his glass without looking. The server began to pour. Cece's heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't think. She didn't weigh the consequences of interrupting a room full of monsters. Instinct took over. "Stop!" Cece screamed. The sound shattered the polite murmurs of the room. Silas froze, the glass halfway to his lips. The server flinched so hard the decanter clattered against the rim of the glass. "Cecilia?" Silas asked, his brow furrowing. "Don't drink it," Cece said, her voice trembling but loud. She stood up, her legs shaking. "It smells wrong. And look at him." She pointed a shaking finger at the server. "He's terrified." Bianca laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Oh, please. The little stray is hallucinating. That is a vintage Cabernet from the cellar. It smells like oak, you idiot." "It smells like almonds," Cece insisted, looking desperately at Silas. "Please, trust me." The room went deadly silent. Silas slowly lowered the glass to the table. He didn't look at Cece. He turned his cobalt gaze slowly, terrifyingly, up to the server. "Thomas," Silas said softly. "Is it?" The boy, Thomas, was hyperventilating now. The decanter rattled in his grip. "Pour a glass," Silas commanded. "Sir?" Thomas squeaked. "Pour a glass," Silas repeated, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with the growl of the wolf beneath. "And drink it." I can't, Alpha. It's against protocol," Thomas stammered, tears leaking from his eyes. "Drink it," Silas roared, slamming his fist onto the table. The heavy wood cracked down the center. Thomas dropped the decanter. It smashed onto the floor, splashing wine onto Silas's boots. The boy fell to his knees, sobbing. "Please, please, Alpha. They said they'd kill my mother. I had no choice." Chaos erupted. The guards by the door drew their weapons. The guests scrambled back from the table. Silas stood up, his height seeming to double as his aura filled the room. He didn't look at the boy. He looked down the length of the table, straight at Councillor Vane. Vane was no longer sitting. He was standing, his face twisted in a snarl, a heavy automatic pistol in his hand aimed directly at Silas's chest. "You should have just died in the snow, Mercer!" Vane screamed. "Down!" Silas moved faster than human eyesight could track. He didn't dive for cover. He dove for Cece. He tackled her chair, sending them both crashing to the marble floor behind the thick obsidian table, just as the deafening crack, crack, crack of gunshots echoed through the hall. Bullets chipped the stone edge of the table, sending sharp shards flying. "Stay down," Silas growled, his body shielding hers completely. "Vane," Silas roared, his voice changing, becoming guttural. "You dare bring human weapons into my house? I brought enough to bury you!" Vane yelled back. Suddenly the room was a war zone. It wasn't just Vane. 3 other council members and 4 guards drew weapons. It was a coup. "Kill them all," Vane commanded. "Leave no witnesses." "Beta Kale," Silas barked. Kale, who had been standing by the door, shifted. It was a gruesome, violent transformation. Bones snapped and reshaped, skin stretching and fur bursting through. In seconds, a massive grey wolf stood where the man had been. Kale launched himself at the traitorous guards, his jaws snapping around a throat. The great hall became a bloodbath. The loyalists shifted into their wolf forms, russet, brown and grey beasts tearing through their expensive suits to defend their king. The traitors fired silver bullets, the only thing that could slow them down. Under the table, Cece was hyperventilating. The noise was deafening. Roars, gunshots, screams. "I have to fight," Silas said, looking down at her. His eyes were glowing fully blue now, his canines extending over his lip. "Stay here. Do not move." "Silas, no!" Cece grabbed his arm. "There's too many of them." "I am the Alpha King," he said, a savage grin touching his face. "This is not too many. This is just exercise." He rolled out from under the table. Cece watched through the gap between the chairs. Silas didn't shift immediately. He moved with lethal human grace, dodging a bullet by a fraction of an inch before grabbing a traitorous guard by the neck and throwing him through the glass window, plummeting down the cliffside. Then he shifted. It was terrifying, a massive explosion of black smoke and fur. The Midnight Wolf. He was twice the size of the others, a monster of shadow and muscle. He lunged at Vane. Vane shifted too, a sickly brown wolf, but he was no match. Silas pinned him to the ground, jaws clamping onto Vane's shoulder, shaking him like a rag doll. But Cece saw something Silas didn't. While the Alpha was focused on Vane, the Gamma, Arthur, a man Cece had thought was kind, was creeping up behind Silas. He held a long, jagged dagger that glowed with a sickly green light. Concentrated wolfsbane. "Silas, behind you!" Cece screamed. Her voice was lost in the cacophony of growls. Arthur raised the dagger. Cece didn't think. She scrambled out from under the table. She grabbed the first thing her hand touched, a heavy silver candelabra. She ran. She wasn't fast, not compared to them, but she was small, and Arthur was focused on the king. Just as Arthur brought the blade down, Cece swung the candelabra with every ounce of starvation-fueled rage she possessed. Clang! The heavy silver base connected with the back of Arthur's human head. It wasn't enough to knock out a werewolf, but it was enough to stun him. Arthur stumbled, the dagger slicing harmlessly through the air inches from Silas's flank. Arthur spun around, his eyes flashing yellow. He snarled, backhanding Cece. The blow sent her flying. She crashed into the stone wall, the breath knocked out of her lungs. Her head cracked against the masonry, and her vision swam. "You filthy little rat," Arthur growled, stepping toward her, the dagger raised. "I'll gut you first, then the king." Silas heard the impact. He turned, dropping Vane's bleeding body. When he saw Arthur standing over Cece, A sound left his throat that shook the foundations of the citadel. It wasn't a growl, it was a sound of pure, unadulterated annihilation. But he was across the room. He wouldn't make it in time. Arthur lunged. Cece looked up, blood trickling into her eye. She held up her hands instinctively to protect her face. She felt a surge of heat in her chest, hotter than the bath, hotter than the fever. It felt like liquid gold pumping through her veins. "No!" she screamed. It wasn't just a scream, it was a command, a ripple of energy, visible as a faint golden distortion in the air, exploded from her palms. It hit Arthur like a freight train. The Gamma Wolf was blasted backward, lifting off his feet and flying 10 feet through the air, before crashing into the long dining table, snapping it in half. Silence fell over the room instantly. Even the wolves stopped fighting. Vane, bleeding on the floor, looked up in horror. Silas stood frozen, his massive wolf-form chest heaving. Cece sat slumped against the wall, her hand still raised, trembling. The air around her shimmered. Arthur groaned in the wreckage of the table, trying to stand, but his limbs wouldn't obey. He had been forced into submission by a voice that wasn't supposed to exist. Silas shifted back. He didn't care about his nudity. The shadows seemed to cling to him to provide coverage. He walked slowly towards Cece, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and confusion. He knelt before her, ignoring the chaos, ignoring the blood. "Cecilia?" he whispered. She lowered her hands, looking at them as if they belonged to a stranger. I don't know what happened. I just wanted him to stop." Dr. Reed, who had been cowering behind a pillar, slowly stepped forward. He adjusted his glasses, staring at Cece. "Alpha," Dr. Reed said, his voice shaking. "I told you there were markers in her blood." "What markers?" Silas demanded, not taking his eyes off her. "That wasn't magic, sir," Dr. Reed whispered. "That was a localized alpha command. But stronger." He swallowed hard. "She isn't human, Alpha. She's a lunar sovereign, a breed of wolf thought to be extinct for 300 years, the only wolves capable of commanding alphas." The whispers started immediately. The guards, the staff, even the traitor Vane. They all looked at the shivering, bruised girl in the bathrobe with a new emotion, fear and worship. Silas reached out, wiping the blood from her temple. "You saved me," he said, a fierce pride burning in his eyes. "Again." "I think I'm going to pass out now," Cece murmured. And she did, collapsing forward into the arms of the king who would burn the world to keep her safe. 3 days had passed since the great hall had been painted with the blood of traitors. Cecilia stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the master suite. The girl staring back was unrecognizable. Gone were the rags, the hollow cheeks, and the haunted eyes of a starving waitress. Her skin glowed with health, a result of the pack's healers and the dormant wolf blood, now singing in her veins. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet that hugged her frame, embroidered with silver thread that looked like constellations. But it was her eyes that had changed the most. The hazel was now flecked with liquid gold, the mark of the sovereign. "Are you ready?" Silas stood at the door. He wore his ceremonial alpha regalia, a black military-style tunic with gold braiding. He looked like a god of war. But when he looked at her, his expression was one of pure devotion. "Do I have to do this?" Cece asked, smoothing the velvet of her dress. "You don't have to do anything," Silas said, walking over and kissing her forehead. "But I thought you might want closure." He offered his arm. "They are waiting." They descended to the throne room, a cavernous stone chamber beneath the citadel. The atmosphere was electric. The entire pack elite was gathered, silent and respectful. In the center of the room, 4 figures knelt on the cold stone floor, their hands bound with silver chains. 2 were familiar, Councillor Vane and Gamma Arthur. They looked broken, beaten, and terrified. But the other 2 made Cece's breath hitch, Mr. Henderson, the diner owner, and Lydia Cross, the sheriff's daughter. When Cece entered, the room went deadly quiet. She walked up the dais to the 2 thrones. She sat in the one beside Silas, her heart pounding, but her head held high. Silas remained standing. "We are here to pass judgment," his voice boomed. "Crimes against the crown, attempted regicide." He pointed at Vane and Arthur, then he pointed to Henderson and Lydia. "And crimes against the mate of the Alpha, cruelty, neglect, abuse." Henderson looked up, sweat pouring down his greasy face. He squinted at the beautiful woman on the throne. Recognition dawned slowly, followed by absolute horror. "Cece," he croaked. "Heart? No, that's impossible. She's trash." Silas didn't even growl. He just looked at Beta Kale. Kale stepped forward and backhanded Henderson across the face, sending a tooth flying. "You will speak to the Lunar Queen with respect," Kyle snarled. Lydia was shaking, her mascara running down her cheeks. "I didn't know," she wailed. "I swear, she was just a nobody living in a trailer. Please, my daddy is the sheriff." "Your father," Silas interrupted coldly, "has been relieved of his duty. He is currently in a cell for corruption. As for you," Silas turned to Cece, "my queen, their fate is yours to decide." Cece looked at them. She remembered the hunger. She remembered Henderson shoving her. She remembered Lydia laughing as she threw slush at her trailer. She felt the old fear rising, but then the golden warmth in her veins surged. She wasn't that girl anymore. She stood up. "Mr. Henderson," Cece said, her voice clear and echoing with a strange, harmonic power. "You fired me for smelling like a wet dog. You let me starve while you threw food in the trash." I can pay you back," Henderson blubbered. "I'll give you the diner." "I already own the diner," Cece said calmly. "Silas bought it this morning, and I'm turning it into a shelter, a free kitchen for everyone you turned away." She stepped closer. "You are banned from Blackwood Ridge. If you are found within 50 miles of this territory, the wolves will hunt you. Leave." Henderson scrambled up, sobbing, and ran toward the doors, tripping over his own feet. Cece turned to Lydia. The blonde girl shrank away. "And you," Cece said softly. "You thought power meant stepping on people who couldn't fight back. You're not going to be exiled, Lydia." Lydia looked up, hopeful. "You're going to work," Cece said, "in the shelter, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, every day. You will learn what it feels like to serve the people you mocked." Lydia opened her mouth to argue, but Cece's eyes flashed gold. "Do you accept?" The command hit Lydia like a physical weight. The girl bowed her head, unable to resist. "Yes, Luna." The guards dragged them away. Now, only the traitors remained, Vane and Arthur. Silas stepped forward, drawing a long sword from his hip. "For treason there is only one sentence." "Wait," Cece said. Silas paused. "Cecilia, they tried to kill me. They tried to kill you." "I know," she said. She looked at Arthur, the man she had blasted through a table. Death is too easy. If they die, they become martyrs to their twisted cause. She looked at Vane. "Strip them." The court gasped. "Strip them of their rank," Cece commanded, her voice vibrating with the sovereign power. "Strip them of their pack connection. Make them Omega rogues. Cast them out into the wild lands without protection. Let them survive on their own, as I did. It was a fate worse than death, to be a wolf without a pack, without territory, in the dangerous wild lands was a sentence of madness and constant fear." Silas smiled, a dark, proud thing. A fitting punishment. He nodded to the guards. Vane screamed as they were dragged away, his pleas echoing off the stone walls until the heavy iron doors slammed shut. Silas turned to the court. He took Cece's hand and raised it high. "Behold," he roared, "the lunar sovereign, the saviour of the king. Long may she reign." "Long may she reign!" the pack shouted, the sound shaking the very mountain. Later that night, the snow began to fall again. Cece stood on the high balcony of the citadel, wrapped in Silas's arms. They watched the white flakes drift down over the dark forest. It looked peaceful now. "You were terrifying today," Silas murmured into her hair. "I've never been more in love." Cece leaned back against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. "I was just doing what I had to do." "You did more than that," Silas said, turning her around to face him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. It wasn't a diamond. It was a band of black obsidian, inlaid with a piece of raw, blue sapphire that matched his eyes. "Cecilia Hart," he whispered, "you found me when I was broken. You fed me when I was starving. You saved me when I was dying. I don't just want you as my mate because of biology. I want you because you are the only person in this world with a heart big enough to rule it." He slid the ring onto her finger. "Will you stay? Not as a guest, not as a refugee, but as my wife, my queen." Cece looked at the ring, then up at the man who had given her everything. She thought about the cold trailer, the loneliness, the hunger, and then she looked at the warmth in his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. Silas kissed her, deep and passionate, as the snow fell around them. Far below in the forest, a wolf howled. It wasn't a howl of pain or loneliness. It was a song of welcome. The pack was whole. The king was safe. And the girl who gave food to a wounded pup had finally, truly, come home. And that, my friends, is the story of how one act of kindness changed the destiny of an entire kingdom. From a freezing trailer to the throne of the Alpha King, Cecilia proved that true power isn't about claws or fangs. It's about the heart. What did you think of the instant karma for Henderson and Lydia? Did Vane deserve a harsher punishment? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of romance, revenge, and werewolf drama, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.